If you look at your perennial garden right now, you might see healthy green leaves, fading flowers, and a few plants that are beginning to look tired. But hidden among that foliage could be the beginnings of next season's problems. Old leaves can harbor fungal spores, pest eggs, and plant debris that you definitely don't want sitting around all winter. And that's why late summer is such an important time to inspect your perennial beds. But before you grab your pruners and start cutting everything down, there's something important you need to know. Not every perennial should be cut to the ground before September 1st. Some benefit from being cleaned up now, while others should be left standing for winter protection, wildlife, or fall interest. So today on Daily Garden Gate, we're looking at 7 perennials that often benefit from a serious late-season cleanup, along with exactly what you should cut, what you should leave, and the mistakes that can create more problems than they solve. The first plant on our list is one that almost every longtime gardener knows: peonies. By late August, peony foliage can look dramatically different from the lush green leaves you admired in spring. You may notice yellowing, brown patches, black spots, or leaves that simply look exhausted. This is one perennial where cleanup can be especially valuable, because diseased foliage can carry fungal problems into the following growing season. If your peonies have suffered from leaf spots or other fungal diseases, leaving infected foliage lying around the crown is not a great idea. Once the foliage has naturally declined and the plant is finished for the season, you can cut the stems down close to the soil surface. Remove the old leaves and stems from the garden, rather than leaving obviously diseased material around the crown. But here's an important distinction. Don't cut perfectly healthy peony foliage simply because the calendar says August 31st. The plant uses its leaves to produce and store energy for next year's growth. If the foliage is still green and healthy, allowing it to remain for a while can help the plant recharge its underground roots. However, if the leaves are heavily diseased, badly damaged, or naturally dying back, cleanup becomes much more important. And when you do cut peonies, remove the debris from the planting area. Good sanitation is one of the simplest tools you have for reducing recurring disease problems. A clean garden bed going into fall is not just prettier, it can give you a much better starting point next spring. Number 2 is garden phlox, and this one deserves special attention because powdery mildew is a common complaint among gardeners growing tall phlox. You may recognize the problem immediately. The leaves develop a white, dusty coating, particularly when conditions have been warm, humid, and poorly ventilated. By late summer, heavily affected plants can look exhausted. Once flowering is finished and the plant is naturally declining, cutting back affected stems can help you remove diseased plant material from the garden. If the foliage is badly infected, don't simply chop it up and leave it as mulch around the plant. Remove the debris instead. There's another reason phlox deserves a late-season inspection: airflow. Dense growth can create a humid environment where fungal diseases have an easier time spreading. During the growing season, proper spacing and good sunlight can help keep foliage drier. But once the season is winding down, removing diseased stems and leaves can reduce the amount of infected material left behind. And if your phlox looks perfectly healthy, there's no need to panic and destroy the plant just because September is approaching. The goal is not aggressive pruning for the sake of pruning. The goal is responsible cleanup. Think of it as preparing the garden for a fresh start. Number 3 is bee balm, also known as monarda. Bee balm is one of those plants that can look absolutely spectacular in summer, attracting bees, butterflies, and other pollinators with its colorful flowers. But after flowering, the foliage can become increasingly vulnerable to powdery mildew, especially in humid conditions. By late summer, you may find leaves covered with that familiar pale coating. If your bee balm has been affected, cutting back the above-ground growth after flowering can be a useful cleanup step. It removes infected foliage and helps prevent old diseased material from becoming part of the garden's winter debris. But don't make the mistake of thinking that bee balm needs to be hacked down every time you see a little discoloration. Some natural decline is completely normal at the end of the season. Also, if you want to collect seeds or provide food and habitat for wildlife, you may choose to leave some seed heads standing. This is where gardening becomes less about rigid rules and more about understanding your plants. If disease prevention is your priority, especially after a serious mildew problem, thorough cleanup makes sense. If your plant is healthy and you value winter structure or seed heads, you have more flexibility. The important thing is knowing why you are cutting. Number 4 is iris, particularly bearded iris. Iris foliage can develop leaf spots and other diseases, and old foliage left around the rhizomes can create an untidy environment where problems may persist. After the growing season has finished and the foliage is clearly declining, removing damaged or diseased leaves can be part of good garden sanitation. But again, timing matters. If your iris leaves are still actively green and healthy, you don't necessarily need to rush out and cut them down simply because September is approaching. When cleaning iris, focus on removing foliage that is clearly damaged, diseased, or finished. Don't bury infected leaves in the immediate planting area and assume they will magically disappear without consequences. And when you finish, take a moment to look at the rhizomes. Iris generally prefer good air circulation and should not be buried deeply. If the plant has been struggling, this late summer inspection is an opportunity to notice overcrowding, poor drainage, or other issues before the next growing season. Sometimes the best disease prevention strategy isn't another treatment, it's improving the conditions around the plant. Number 5 is daylily, especially when the foliage has become badly damaged or diseased. Daylilies are tough plants, but their leaves can develop unattractive spots and discoloration as the season progresses. After blooming has finished and the foliage begins to decline, you can remove old or badly damaged leaves to tidy the plant and reduce the amount of diseased material remaining in the garden. If the entire clump looks exhausted, trimming the foliage back can make the bed look dramatically cleaner. However, there's an important reason not to automatically cut every daylily too early. Green leaves are still working for the plant. They capture sunlight and help the plant store energy in its roots. So, if your daylily foliage is green, healthy, and actively functioning, there is usually no advantage in removing it prematurely just to make the garden look tidy. Wait until the foliage is naturally declining, or remove only the damaged sections. Gardeners sometimes confuse a clean-looking garden with a healthy garden. They are not always the same thing. A little green foliage left standing can actually be doing useful work.
Number 6 is hosta. And this is where pest management becomes especially interesting. Hostas are famous for their large leaves, but those same leaves can become damaged by slugs, insects, weather, and disease as summer progresses. By the time late summer arrives, some hostas look less like the stars of the shade garden and more like plants that desperately need a reset. If the foliage has become heavily damaged or diseased, removing it after the growing season can help clean up the planting area. But don't confuse slug damage for a reason to immediately cut a healthy hosta to the ground in August. If the leaves are still green and functional, the plant can continue using them to build energy for next year. In many gardens, the better approach is to remove severely damaged leaves while leaving healthy foliage in place until it naturally declines. Then, once the plant has gone dormant later in the season, you can remove the remaining foliage. This is especially useful in areas where winter conditions are harsh, because the timing of cleanup can vary significantly depending on your climate. And that brings us to number 7, salvia, particularly perennial types that have finished their main flowering period and are becoming messy or diseased. Many salvias can benefit from trimming after flowering, especially if the foliage has become unattractive. Cutting back spent growth can encourage a tidier appearance and, depending on the species and growing conditions, may even encourage additional flowering. But once again, don't assume every salvia should be reduced to bare ground on the exact same date. The better question is, what does your plant look like right now? Is it healthy? Is it still flowering? Is it producing new growth? Is the foliage diseased? Is the plant naturally entering dormancy? Those observations are more useful than blindly following a calendar. Gardening calendars are helpful guides, but your plants don't carry watches. Weather, region, variety, soil, sunlight, and rainfall all influence when a perennial is ready for its end-of-season cleanup. Now, there's something else you need to understand before you begin cutting. Clean tools matter. If you move from one diseased plant to another with the same dirty pruners, you can potentially spread plant pathogens. So, before moving between plants, especially when you are dealing with obvious disease, clean your cutting tools. You don't need an elaborate collection of gardening equipment. A sharp, clean pair of pruners and a way to sanitize them between diseased plants can go a long way towards responsible garden hygiene. And here's another mistake gardeners make all the time: leaving diseased leaves on the ground. You cut the plant, toss the foliage around its base, and walk away. That might look like natural gardening, but when the material is visibly diseased, it can be a poor choice. Healthy plant material can often be composted properly, depending on your composting system, but heavily diseased material is better handled according to local guidance rather than casually spreading it around your garden. The whole purpose of cleanup is to reduce the amount of problematic material remaining in the planting area. You also want to avoid cutting plants simply because they look slightly unattractive. Gardens are living ecosystems, and not every brown leaf is a disease emergency. Some foliage naturally ages as temperatures change and flowering ends. Some plants provide seeds for birds, others create shelter for beneficial insects, and many perennials offer winter structure that makes the garden more interesting during the colder months. If you cut everything down to bare soil at the first sign of autumn, you may remove far more than you intended.
This is why the phrase "cut everything down before September 1st" needs a little context. September 1st can be a useful reminder to inspect your perennial garden, but it is not a universal deadline for every climate and every perennial. In some regions, plants may still be actively growing in September. In others, cooler weather may already be arriving. A gardener in a warm climate may have a completely different schedule from someone in a colder growing zone. Your local conditions should always have the final word. So instead of treating September 1st as a rigid deadline, think of it as your perennial health checkpoint. Walk through your garden and inspect every plant. Look underneath leaves. Check for obvious fungal problems. Look for stems that have collapsed. Examine plants that flowered earlier in the season. Ask yourself which foliage is healthy and which foliage is finished. Then make your pruning decisions based on what you actually see. And don't forget about the soil around these plants. Once you have removed diseased foliage and old stems, clear away obvious debris from the crown. Avoid piling thick, wet layers of plant material directly against the base of the perennial. Good air circulation and sensible moisture management can make a huge difference. At the same time, don't leave the soil completely exposed, just because you think a perfectly bare garden bed is ideal. A suitable layer of mulch can help protect roots and moderate soil conditions, but it should not be packed tightly against plant crowns. There's also a hidden benefit to doing this inspection now. You can spot problems before they become next year's mystery. Maybe your phlox consistently develops mildew. Maybe your peonies repeatedly suffer from leaf spots. Maybe your iris bed stays too wet. Maybe your hostas are being hammered by pests every summer. Instead of simply cleaning everything up and forgetting about it, write down what happened. Next year, you can improve spacing, sunlight, watering practices, airflow, or other growing conditions that may be contributing to the problem. And remember, pruning is only one piece of disease prevention. Healthy plants are generally better equipped to handle stress, so focus on the basics throughout the season. Give plants the sunlight they require. Avoid unnecessary overhead watering when foliage needs to stay dry. Don't crowd plants together simply because you want a fuller-looking garden immediately. And don't over-fertilize just because a plant looks tired. Excessive soft growth can sometimes create a more favorable environment for certain pests and diseases. As you move through your garden, you may also discover that some plants should actually be left alone. Ornamental grasses, coneflowers, sedums, echinacea, and many other perennials can provide valuable winter structure and wildlife resources. Their seed heads can remain attractive long after flowers disappear. So while today's list focuses on plants that may benefit from late-season cleanup, the bigger lesson is not cut everything. The bigger lesson is prune with a purpose.
If a plant has serious disease, remove the affected material. If foliage is naturally dying back, wait for the appropriate time and then clean it up. If a plant is healthy and still photosynthesizing, don't remove valuable foliage prematurely. If seed heads provide winter interest or food for wildlife, consider leaving them. And if you're unsure about a specific perennial, check the recommendations for that particular species and your local growing conditions before making a major cut. So, let's quickly recap the 7 plants we talked about today: peonies, garden phlox, bee balm, iris, daylilies, hostas, and perennial salvias.
These are not 7 plants that every gardener in every climate must blindly cut down before September 1st. They are 7 perennials worth putting on your late summer inspection list because removing spent, heavily damaged, or diseased growth can help improve garden sanitation and prepare your beds for the next season. And there's one final thing I want you to remember. A healthy garden isn't created by cutting more. It's created by making better decisions. The goal isn't to make your garden look perfectly empty before fall arrives. The goal is to understand which plants need attention, which foliage is still doing important work, and which disease-carrying debris should not be allowed to linger. So before September arrives, grab your gloves, inspect those perennial beds, sharpen and clean your pruners, and start with the plants that actually need attention. Don't rush. Look closely. Your garden will tell you what it needs if you take the time to observe it. And if you found this helpful, make sure you're subscribed to Daily Garden Gate because we're heading into one of the most important transitions of the gardening year. Fall isn't the end of the garden. It's the beginning of preparation for everything that comes next. We'll be covering what to prune, what to plant, what to leave standing, and the simple mistakes that can make next spring much harder than it needs to be. Thanks for watching Daily Garden Gate. Take care of your garden, learn from what it shows you, and remember, the best gardeners don't just grow plants, they learn when to step in and when to let nature take over.